As the deadly siege on the Libyan city of Misrata continues, aid agencies are warning of a humanitarian disaster as Gaddafi's forces continue their attacks. So why are so many people being killed and injured when NATO says its mandate is to protect civilians? And what more can Western powers do to help the rebels in their push towards Tripoli? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Darren Jordon. For more than 7 weeks, Muammar Gaddafi's troops have been laying siege to the city of Misrata. It's Libya's third largest city and the last major rebel foothold to the west of the country. Aid agencies say the humanitarian situation there is dire. There is a critical shortage of food, power, water and medicines, and it's getting worse every day. From inside Misrata, Jonah Hull reports.
Approaching Misrata port under cover of darkness, but well in view of NATO radar.
This is a NATO warship conducting United Nations mandated embargo operations.
Ours is a Maltese trawler laden with food and humanitarian supplies. Not all the boats docking here carry cargo that is so benign. The sea is a vital supply route, the only one for a city besieged by land. For 2 months, battle has raged along a front line that cuts Misrata in half. No one knows what's become of civilians on the other side, but the defenders of the city do appear to be gaining ground. A ragtag band of fighters who until just 2 months ago were mostly civilians, now using limited weaponry and a lot of heart, are holding regime forces back. One man told me in their dreams will they take this city back, but that surely won't stop Gaddafi's men from trying. As they do, the price of resistance gets higher. The main hospital was destroyed 3 weeks ago. Now the dead are brought to a smaller clinic where they wait among children's things in the pediatric ward. The barely living, meanwhile, await medical evacuation by sea, vacating beds that will quickly be filled again.
Some days we couldn't count, believe me, because hundreds, so we didn't count. We have to treat, not count.
We try to change her clothes. She's crying.
The dead and injured are not only those doing the fighting.
This kid, she was at home. She was playing in the garden at home with her family. So suddenly there's an attack, which is a big with multiple missiles, which we call the Grad. I think I'm not a military person, but I think there's multiple missiles comes with one of these missiles hit their house.
With long-range weapons being fired into civilian areas, no place is safe.
Some people, they ask us, do you have enough supply of painkiller or this kind of medication? We don't know. Today we have. But how many patients will come, how many patients will die, how many injuries we will receive, we never know.
A father watches helpless as doctors work to revive his son, a shrapnel injury to his head. A man wounded on the front line will live to fight another day. It was described as a quiet morning. They knew it wouldn't last. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Misrata, Libya.
Well, as concern grows for the 300,000 civilians trapped in Misrata, the UK's International Development Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, says Britain is considering plans to increase aid to civilians in the besieged city. This is some of what Mitchell had to say. The humanitarian situation in Misrata is of great concern. The international community should be ready to respond. It's vital that we continue to get help, such as food, water or medical supplies, through to the people. Humanitarian agencies must be given free and unfettered access to Misrata and other areas affected by fighting. Well, to discuss all of this are our three guests. In Rome, Mohamed Abdul Malek, he's the chairman of Libya Watch. In Cambridge, Paul Smyth, he's a defence analyst, director of R31 Consulting, specialising in defence matters. Mr. Smyth is also a former UK military officer. In Washington, D.C., Steve Clemons, the director of the American Strategy Program at the new America Foundation. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Mohamed Malek, let me start with you in Rome. What have you been hearing now about the situation in Misrata? The town, of course, has been under siege for weeks. There appears to be little electricity, food, water. How desperate is the situation there?
Well, one thing is certain, that the people of Misrata are holding their own and they are able to defend their city. However, the cost to civilians and to the infrastructure and to the children and the women and the elderly is unbelievable. Bearing in mind that this brutal regime has actually cut off the water supply to the city with the hope that he would, I don't know, drive the people out of the city or what. Now, the bombing is having its toll on the resistance, definitely. The supply of medicine is short. There is no space in the makeshift hospital that they've made. They're running out of not only medicine that is needed for those who have been wounded in the field, but also medicine that is needed for ordinary day-to-day living, like insulin. Many diabetic patients are going into insulin coma and are dying. Others are dying because of curable diseases that in an ordinary country there will be adequate supply to prevent those diseases. I've been told by doctor friends that they also are forced to amputate limbs because not because it's a medical necessity as such, but because there isn't enough antibiotics, there isn't enough medicine to prevent diseases from spreading to the rest of the body, and therefore the necessity to amputate a foot here or a hand there. Children are suffering the worst because children don't know what's going on, and being children, they need to play, they need to, and therefore they're attacked. So the situation from a humanitarian perspective is really unbelievable. This is an army that is supposed to defend its people. This is a government that is supposed to care about its citizens. It's actually laying siege to a city for over seven weeks. Yes. No, it's incredible what's going on.
OK, let's bring in Paul Smyth in Cambridge. Paul Smyth, Mohamed Malek paints a terrible picture of things happening in Misrata. What's your assessment, though, of the significance of the city? It's one of the last main towns on the road to Tripoli. Presumably, if it falls to Gaddafi's forces, the rebels might not be able to recover the momentum in the battle space.
Darren, I think you're right. It's an incredibly important city, and therefore the sea line of communication to it is incredibly important. I think for understandable reasons, the revolutionary forces that have been based in the Benghazi area have shown that they cannot really advance against opposition from regime troops. They're able to drive forward if the regime troops have retreated after they've been attacked from the air. But they struggle to advance offensively, take ground and hold it. And we've seen them repeatedly move to the west and then retreat to the east. So if the fighters are to relieve the siege of Misrata, it will have to be from the sea. And I think the importance of the city, as you say, is key because Tripoli is far too far over the horizon. I think Sirte would be too much in favour of the regime to fall simply. And therefore the significance of Misrata is that the rebel forces are able to show that they do have support in the west of the country and that they can defeat ultimately the regime forces.
Steve Clemons in Washington, D.C. As we've been hearing, the battle for Misrata is causing a terrible humanitarian disaster. But does it underline the simple fact that Gaddafi is not going to go easily and that Western powers perhaps have underestimated his staying power?
Well, I think it's very clear that they've underestimated Gaddafi's abilities. You know, at the beginning of this process, I actually participated along with some other think tank and policy people in a White House meeting where some of the scenarios were, what do you do if Gaddafi is holed up in a small corner of Tripoli and you've got the rest of the government? That was the scenario they were looking at because the opposition forces had succeeded so quickly and what looked almost decisively against Gaddafi. And so the real story is Gaddafi's pushback, rollback, his ability, despite significant command staff defections and diplomatic defections, that he still has enough trust and management of his means of operation that he rolled right back and now looks as if he's in a very, very strong position. And so we're engaged. When President Obama came out and said that he had hoped this be a matter of days and not weeks, it's now looking like months and hopefully not years that we're into. And I think that there's just no doubt that they underestimated the possibility that this could turn into a long-run civil war. That's where we're at today.
Mohamed Abdul Malek in Rome, NATO insists its mandate is to protect civilians, but when you see the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Misrata, do you think NATO should be doing more? And if so, what more do you think NATO should be doing?
Definitely it should be doing more. It's not doing enough. This was expressed not by a Libyan, but by the French and the British. And I think the excuse being put forward for NATO's case is that the chain command is such that it requires a lengthy process from when the mark has been set to when the plane actually shoots the target. They're talking about 8 hours, which is frankly not adequate enough. And if that is the case, if we're going to dismiss any political agenda behind this, and we're going to say that it is the chain of command, then why did NATO take on a mission that it cannot fulfill? Why did it take on the 1973 resolution, which stipulates the protection of civilians, when NATO's chain of command will not be able to do that? And when the coalition before NATO were doing an excellent job. Before NATO took over, the coalition were hitting the targets, they were hitting them hard and fast. So why did NATO take power? Why did NATO take control? That is a question that I'm putting forward.
All right, well, let's put that question to Paul Smyth in Cambridge. Paul, Mohamed Malik there saying, why did NATO take on the job? Because the British Prime Minister David Cameron has said the UK would not invade, and it was important, of course, to stick to the UN mandate. But, of course, there are different interpretations of the military application of the mandate. So is that confusion, therefore, allowing more civilians to die in places like Misrata?
Well, I think the importance, addressing your first point, the importance of NATO being in the lead is that obviously if you can get the alliance to support the operation, then it opens up the possibility of more nations contributing forces to that operation. So I think the importance of NATO being in command is to broaden and strengthen and deepen the coalition, including nations like Qatar and Sweden, that are not part of NATO but still following the mission. The point that Mohamed mentioned about the chain of command, I wasn't aware that that was a problem in this particular operation. It has been a problem in the past. If we think back to Bosnia during the UN peacekeeping days there in the early 90s, a very long and protracted command change so that fleeting targets for opportunities perhaps were missed. But I think the problem NATO suffers now perhaps has two aspects to it. One is that it is constrained quite properly by a determination not to inflict collateral civilian casualties, because if it did so, it would obviously undermine the mandate that it has with the UN resolution to intervene in Libya. Secondly, though, and I think this is where NATO should be perhaps looking at itself in the mirror closely, is whether or not it's actually committing sufficient forces for the task. And my gut feeling at the moment is that there aren't enough strike assets that are able to attack targets on the ground to ensure that there is a persistence of coverage simultaneously across key areas of the ground in Libya, so that it can take military effect against regime forces when and where they take action against civilian areas. And that, I think, is the ultimate problem for NATO. It's a shortage of assets.
Yeah, and also, Paul, a big question about the effectiveness of NATO, given the resources that you mentioned. Let's put that now to Steve Clemons in Washington. Steve, after more than a month of NATO airstrikes, as you say, Colonel Gaddafi's regime is still surviving, and the rebels who are trying to oust him have made very little progress towards Tripoli. So in terms of the battle space on the ground, are we now at a stalemate?
Well, I think, stalemates, we may be in a de facto stalemate in the sense that it doesn't seem apparent right now which side can deliver a knockout blow quickly to the other to begin, tilting the ultimate outcome in either Gaddafi's direction or the rebels' direction. I think that what Paul talked about the stock of power and the lack of resources, I've been talking about NATO's stretch marks. There's a lot of frustration in NATO about forces and material deployed in Afghanistan that's not been going as well as they like. Now they've added on a very large, complex mission, and there were a number of military planners through this exercise, no doubt, despite a horrific humanitarian situation and despite what I feel is an appropriate emotional concern for people trying to take back their government, that this was just a very, very different story, and that the deployment of forces, the forces in the area, the NATO capability in southern Italy simply wasn't enough. And so the gamble they took was that they would be able to strike quickly, that Benghazi was doable, and that perhaps by knocking out key sites in Tripoli, other forces in Benghazi and throughout the country, that would provide a platform that would give the opposition enough to roll back. And that hasn't proven to be the case. So we seem to be allied with a partner in Libya that doesn't have the wherewithal, capability, training, or organization to prevail. And so that really changes the dynamic, I think, substantially. And in my view, it's very worrisome. I've been worried about the slippery slope into a very different kind of engagement that I think the three key nations, France, Britain, and the United States, weren't really prepared for. But after Cameron, Sarkozy, and Obama's op-ed, what has happened is this civil war and this outcome are now owned by these countries. And what we've been seeing in the Arab Spring, or the attempt to create an Arab Spring, were opposition players in Tunisia or Egypt or elsewhere who owned their own revolution. But this has now been subcontracted to other players, and I think that you're now in a trap between a commitment and wanting to see Gaddafi to go, a demand for Gaddafi to go, but yet a limited willingness to deploy the kind of forces and whatnot to really make that happen. So I think you not only have a de facto stalemate, but you have a political stalemate within each of these countries that didn't think they would have to go as far as they're now being called to do.
And that's a critical point you make, which I'm going to put to Mohamed Malek, about the effectiveness of the opposition, about the effectiveness of the rebels. What about arming the rebels? I mean, obviously, we've had reports that Qatar has given some equipment, but should the international community be giving more in terms of equipment and training to help to organize the rebels, their command and control structure, getting them to get momentum on the ground?
Definitely. I mean, my colleague before me spoke about partners, calling the revolutionary forces partners who are not able to deliver in terms of management, in terms of organization, in terms of arms. Well, how could they do that when the majority of them were civilians prior to the 17th of February? Some of them have never even carried a weapon in their life. And therefore, what we need here is actually training and arming of the revolutionary forces. If we're going to end this bloodshed in Libya, then the revolutionary forces need to be trained and need to be armed in such an extent that they would be able to meet the onslaught of the Gaddafi regiments and the Gaddafi forces. Otherwise, this stalemate will just prolong for more weeks. It will eventually end because no one in Libya wants Gaddafi to rule. And the Libyan people are not talking about a civil war. None of us are talking about a civil war. Because what we see it simply as Gaddafi and his forces on one hand, and the Libyan people on the other hand.
Paul Smyth in Cambridge, are we talking here about a widening of the UN mandate? Because if you interpret British Prime Minister David Cameron's words, he said no occupation, but presumably that doesn't rule out perhaps small groups of special forces who could improve the effectiveness of the rebels. I mean, the devil is very much in the detail here, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. My personal feeling is that you could put troops on the ground in small numbers and you would not breach a prohibition on occupation. But obviously nations do interpret that differently within the NATO alliance, as they interpret differently whether or not the all measures necessary mandate that they have with a Chapter 7 resolution from the UN would allow them to arm the rebels. I think arming the rebels is a bit like the no-fly zone was before the mandate was issued by the UN. It attracts a lot of focus, but it's perhaps not the important thing. Whereas the no-fly zone took a lot of media and political interest, what was really needed was a mandate to allow air power to take effect on the ground. Similarly, here, Where we've been talking perhaps in the past about has NATO air power become the rebels' air force, really we should be looking at can the rebels become NATO's army? And just arming the rebels is not the solution. As your other speakers have said, it needs more than that. It needs training. There might be, if you just armed the rebels, a division between NATO members as to whether that was legal. Once you've given arms to the rebels, you have no control over how they're used. It would be incredibly counterproductive if, for example, NATO was to provide artillery or rocket systems to the rebels and these were fired and they ended up killing civilians, because it would very much undermine NATO's mandate. So what the rebels need, I think, is training. They need command and control. They need better logistics. They need better leadership at a tactical level. They need an awful lot of things above just being given weapons.
Steve Clemons in Washington, is this really just a question of timing here? Because perhaps if the rebels had been armed at the start of this conflict, then NATO may not have even bothered with a no-fly zone. Would that have been a better option?
Well, in my view, when we were debating the no-fly zone, I think Paul's exactly right. It attracted attention. There seemed to be other practical things that would have a very minimal Western footprint that might have helped the rebels in that key moment when the momentum was so much on their side. One was from AWACS planes and others jamming Gaddafi's communications. He certainly was jamming theirs, and that could have been done. Secondly, while I would have opposed U.S. systems being sold and provided to the rebel forces or provided to them, that I would have helped facilitate other caches that they need, because they were literally running out of ammunition in the towns just east of Tripoli. And thirdly, I would have, moved to jam communications, to provide weapon systems, and also to provide targeting intelligence to the degree that we could, that would have allowed some of these forces that were there and organized. Now, I think everything Paul said is right. The issues that I've had with this humanitarian intervention is that there are limits, and I'm not popular for saying it, but not all revolutions succeed. In fact, the history of revolutions is most often they don't. If we had not invaded, if we had not done this, I'm sure that Gaddafi would have done some horrible things. But he might have engendered his own instability in the future. We now own this, and I think that's a problem both in this region, in which Western intervention is looked at so skeptically and so malignly. So.
Let me just get a final thought, if I can, from Mohamed Abdul Malek in Rome, and just talk about the politics for a second. I think there's a general consensus that we are at a military stalemate on the ground. If the rebels lose the military fight, does that weaken the political options open to the opposition? Very briefly.
Well, I think the stalemate does open the possibility for a political solution. But any political solution need to fulfill three requirements. Otherwise, the Libyan people and the revolutionary will never accept them. First of all is that Libya must be united and Tripoli is its capital. We will not accept a split Libya. Number two is Gaddafi must leave Libya, must go outside Libya. And if he remains, he is to remain in prison. And the third thing is that the children of Colonel Gaddafi must not have any political future in Libya. They are not to govern Libya in any form or in any way whatsoever.
Let me get a thought now from Paul Smyth in Cambridge. Paul, how does the outcome of the military campaign play into the political options open to both sides?
If we're going to produce, if you like, a rebel army, that's going to take a long time, relatively speaking. But it'd be interesting to know particularly what Mohamed thinks about how fragile the morale is of the regime forces, because if there was, through the attrition of these forces via NATO air power, a sudden collapse of morale, it would then, I think, expose to what is the genuine amount of popular support that Gaddafi has. If he doesn't have much, if what we see tends to be more fabricated than genuine, then I think it could actually unravel quite quickly if the morale of those forces broke down. If not, though, then I think we could be in for a long time, and that would obviously affect the political situation.
Yeah, let me just put that to Steve Clemons. Steve, how do you see the political outcome based on what's happening on the ground militarily now?
Well, I see the political outcome bad for those allied forces that initiated this process. The longer that Gaddafi survives, the more likely that countries like Brazil, India, Turkey, whatnot will provide back channels and back doors that do deals with Gaddafi, just like the United States did with China after Tiananmen. That the consensus that developed against Gaddafi internationally has an expiration date. And if he survives beyond that expiration date, I think you'll see the international consensus come apart. And that puts the rebels and this whole effort very much in doubt. And I think it makes Britain, France, the United States look much more impotent than they would like to look.
Thanks to our guests, Mohamed Abdul Malek in Rome, Paul Smyth in Cambridge, and Steve Clemons in Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.